The sun dipped low behind the rolling Texas hills as Henry Barlow tugged the frayed rope tied around the neck of his Mustang. The colt, all ribs and hollow flanks, stumbled behind him into the dusty auction pen. Around the corral, ranchers with sun-leathered faces leaned on wooden rails, boots tapping, eyes narrowed with amusement. Somewhere in the crowd, Vernon Pritchard, who once envied Henry's thriving ranch, spat a wad of tobacco and chuckled under his breath, loud enough for Henry to hear. Once, folks respected the Barlow name. Now, they laughed behind his back, calling him a fool clinging to dying land and dying dreams. His wife, Elsie, had passed 3 winters ago, and their daughter, Lorraine, had left for Houston, never looking back. All Henry had left was this colt he named Whiskey, born the same stormy night Elsie died. Maybe that's why he'd held on so long. Maybe that's why it hurt so much to stand here now, begging these men for a chance to keep the lights on a few more months. The auctioneer, a skinny kid named Clyde Dillard, tapped the microphone, voice cracking like a boy pretending to be a man. "All right, gentlemen. Up next, a 3-year-old Mustang named Whiskey. Starting bid, $50. The laughter rolled through the pen like thunder before the rain. A ranch hand snorted, $50? He ain't worth the rope he's tied with. Even Clyde tried to hide a wince as he forced a grin. Whiskey shifted beside Henry, hooves scraping the packed dirt, ears flicking back at the taunts. Henry placed a weathered hand on the colt's trembling neck, feeling every bone beneath the thin skin. He whispered low so only the animal could hear, "Steady, boy. We ain't dead yet." He glanced at the sky, heavy clouds gathering like creditors at his door. The storm was coming, one way or another. 50. Do I hear 50? Clyde's voice cracked again. Not a hand rose. Not one. Amos Kinney, big and red-faced, yelled from the back, "Hey, Henry! I'll give you 20 and a bottle of cheap whiskey for that skeleton. Seems fair, don't it?" The laughter that followed stung more than the biting wind curling over the fence line. Then, as the first fat raindrops tapped Henry's battered hat, a voice Henry hadn't heard in decades cut through the noise, low, steady, commanding. 500. The corral fell silent. All eyes turned toward the far end of the pen, where Roscoe Hensley, a ghost from Henry's past, stepped forward. Thunder cracked overhead, but all Henry heard was the pounding of his own heart, warning him, this wasn't salvation. This was the past, come to collect its due. For a moment, Henry Barlow couldn't breathe. The name Roscoe Hensley hadn't passed his lips in nearly 20 years, yet here he stood, boots caked in red dirt, eyes locked on Henry like a man looking at unfinished business. The ranchers, who seconds ago were laughing at Henry's shame, now shifted uncomfortably, sensing something older and darker than a poor man's misfortune unfolding in the storm-chilled air. Roscoe pushed through the crowd with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who knew he owned every gaze pinned to him. Time had turned his once black hair silver, but his shoulders still carried the same weight of authority that made him dangerous back when he and Henry had carved their brands into every acre between Dillard Creek and Kinney's Bluff. Roscoe stopped at the corral fence, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, and repeated, softer but with a warning hidden in it, 500. The auctioneer, Clyde Dillard, glanced between them like a boy caught in a bar fight he'd never survive. He cleared his throat, voice barely more than a squeak. 500 going once?" The crowd stayed hushed, eyes darting between Roscoe and Henry, hungry for whatever old grudge was about to be dragged back into daylight. Amos Kinney muttered to Vernon Pritchard, "I thought those two were finished years ago." Henry's throat tightened as memories clawed at him. Late nights in Roscoe's barn, hush deals made under the moonlight, promises that bled into betrayal. Whiskey shifted nervously beside him, pulling Henry back to the now. He realized then that Roscoe's money wasn't kindness, it was a leash disguised as charity. If he accepted it, he'd owe Roscoe more than he'd ever repay. But what choice did he have? The bank would take his land by the end of the month, and Lorraine wouldn't answer his calls anymore. "I'm not selling him to you, Roscoe," Henry said, voice low but steady, rain dripping from his chin onto Whiskey's mane. A few men gasped. No one had ever told Roscoe Hensley no in public, not and walked away unscathed. Roscoe's smile was thin as a knife's edge. He stepped closer to the corral rail, eyes narrowing just enough for Henry to see the storm behind them. "You think you got better offers, old man? Or you'd rather let that bag of bones starve beside you on that worthless land you're about to lose?" Thunder rolled across the hills, and the wind whipped through the pen, rattling the loose boards like bones in a box. Henry stood firm, one hand on Whiskey's neck, the other clenched at his side. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of the man he used to be, the man who wouldn't bend, no matter the storm. But deep down, he knew, turning down Roscoe tonight would come with a price far higher than $500. Rain hammered the tin roof of Henry Barlow's barn long after the auction pen emptied out. Inside, the smell of damp straw mixed with the faint sweetness of old hay, doing little to calm the restless Mustang. Whiskey paced in his stall, hooves clacking against worn boards, every flick of his ears echoing Henry's own unease. Thunder cracked again outside, but it was the memory of Roscoe Hensley's smirk that rattled Henry more than the storm. He'd dragged Whiskey back home in the pouring rain, ignoring the hushed voices of the other ranchers and Clyde Dillard's embarrassed handshake. What did they care? To them, he was just a fool who'd turned down money he couldn't afford to lose, too stubborn to swallow his pride and too blind to see the danger in saying no to a man like Roscoe. Henry cursed under his breath as he rubbed Whiskey's neck, feeling the colt's thin body tremble. "Don't you worry, boy. I've dealt with snakes before." A sudden knock on the barn door startled both man and horse. Whiskey snorted, dancing sideways. Henry wiped rain from his brow and opened the heavy wooden door to see Lorraine standing there, soaked to the bone, her dark hair plastered to her cheeks. He hadn't heard her truck pull up over the storm. She looked older than he remembered, sadness carved into her young face like lines on old leather. Behind her, a lone headlight cast ghostly shadows across the muddy yard. "Daddy," she said, voice almost drowned by the wind, "I heard what happened at the auction. Vernon Pritchard called me. He said Roscoe's back in town, and he's looking to collect on old debts." Her eyes dropped to the colt behind him. "And you brought that poor thing back here to starve?" Henry bristled, the same old anger flaring between father and daughter like dry brush catching a spark. "You don't get to show up here and lecture me, Lorraine. Where were you when the bank came knocking? When your mother—" His voice caught. He couldn't say her name with this storm roaring in his chest. Lorraine stepped closer, ignoring the mud soaking her boots. She reached past him and laid her hand on Whiskey's muzzle. The Mustang stilled under her touch, eyes softening as if he recognized the warmth he'd never known. "Daddy, this ranch is dying. And if Roscoe's really back, he won't just take your horse. He'll take everything. Let me help you, before it's too late." Outside, lightning split the sky wide open, flooding the barn with a white flash that made Henry see, if only for an instant, everything he was about to lose, and everything he might save if he could swallow the old pride choking him since the day Elsie died. Henry Barlow barely slept that night. He lay on the old cot by Whiskey's stall, listening to the colt's shallow breathing and the low murmur of the storm drifting away into silence. In the dim glow of a single hanging bulb, he replayed Lorraine's words over and over. "Roscoe's back, and he's looking to collect." No matter how many times he tried to push the thought aside, it pressed on his chest like a stone he couldn't lift. Lorraine had stayed too, curled up in her mother's old room, the door cracked just enough for Henry to see the ghost of his wife in her shadow. He wondered when Lorraine's hair had turned so much darker, when the light had left her eyes. Maybe the same day it left his. He didn't know if her return meant forgiveness or another fight, but he knew one thing. She was right. He couldn't fight Roscoe alone this time. At first light, he saddled up his old mare, Daisy, and tied Whiskey's rope halter to the saddle horn. Whiskey, bony and tired, followed with slow, hesitant steps. Lorraine appeared in the barn doorway, boots half-laced, hair tied back with one of Elsie's faded scarves. She looked at him the way her mother used to, equal parts anger and unspoken love. "Where are you going, Daddy?" Henry avoided her eyes as he checked the cinch strap. "To see Clyde Dillard's uncle in town. If I can't sell the horse outright, maybe I can trade him for enough feed to keep the bank off our necks another week." He didn't mention that he planned to talk to Sheriff Doyle Whitley too. Roscoe's shadow stretched long across these hills, and Henry needed to know if the law would stand with him, or vanish like it did all those years ago. Lorraine stepped forward, planting herself in front of Daisy's nose. "You can't outrun Roscoe with half a plan and a starving horse, Daddy. Let me help you talk to the bank. Or at least to Vernon Pritchard. He owes you more than he lets on." Her voice trembled, but her hands balled into fists at her sides, just like Elsie's when she fought for this ranch. Henry wanted to shout that she didn't understand, that Vernon was just another vulture circling what Roscoe aimed to kill outright. But before he could speak, a car engine growled up the muddy drive. Through the barn doors, Henry saw a black truck roll to a stop behind Lorraine's old pickup. Out stepped Roscoe Hensley, dry as a bone under a wide black hat, smiling like the devil who'd found his due. And just like that, Henry knew there was no more running. Roscoe had brought the storm right to his door. Roscoe Hensley stood just beyond the barn doors, his polished boots sinking into the mud like he owned even the ground beneath Henry's feet. The early sun glanced off his silver hair, but his grin was dark as sin itself. He didn't bother with greetings. He never had time for polite lies. Instead, his eyes flicked from Henry to Lorraine and back to Whiskey, who trembled behind Henry's old mare. "Well now, Barlow," Roscoe drawled, his voice smooth as whiskey gone sour. "Looks like you didn't take my offer last night. That's disappointing, disrespectful, too, considering our history. And here I was, thinking we might settle things neighborly." He stepped closer, wiping a fleck of dust from his hat brim as if it offended him more than Henry's defiance. Lorraine moved between them so fast Henry barely caught her arm before she lunged at Roscoe. "You think you can just show up here and bully my father? We don't owe you a damn thing, Roscoe." Her voice cracked like a whip in the cold morning air. For a second, Henry saw Elsie's fire in her eyes, and it made his chest ache in ways he hadn't felt in years. Roscoe's smile didn't waver, but his eyes turned to steel as they met Lorraine's. "Sweetheart, you don't know half of what your father owes me. If he'd kept his word back then, you'd be living in Houston in a house 3 times the size of this falling-down barn. But here we are, him trying to sell off a half-dead horse like it's gonna buy back his dignity." He turned to Henry, voice dropping low. "I'm done waiting, Henry. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to collect." Henry's fists clenched so hard his knuckles burned. He stepped in front of Lorraine, blocking Roscoe's view of her and Whiskey alike. "I won't let you take what's mine, Roscoe. Not my land, not my family, and not this horse. Do what you came to do, but don't stand here pretending you've got the law behind you." He could feel Lorraine's hand gripping the back of his coat, rooting him to the dirt floor. Roscoe's grin slipped, replaced by a shadow that darkened the morning more than the clouds gathering overhead. He leaned in, voice low enough that only Henry could hear. "The law doesn't matter when you own the man wearing the badge, old friend. Sheriff Whitley remembers which side his bread is buttered on. You'll see soon enough." Then Roscoe turned, boots crunching on the gravel as he walked back to his truck, leaving Henry and Lorraine staring into the muddy yard, knowing the storm had truly come home, and there was no sheriff alive who'd save them now. Long after Roscoe's black truck vanished down the rutted drive, Henry and Lorraine stood in the muddy yard, the cold wind cutting through their silence. Whiskey nudged at Henry's sleeve, sensing the tension in his trembling hands. The old man exhaled a breath he'd been holding since Roscoe's threat left his lips. He turned to his daughter, the weight of years and secrets heavy on his shoulders. "I should have burned every bridge to that man a long time ago," he rasped. Lorraine crossed her arms tight against her chest, eyes narrowed toward the empty road Roscoe had taken. "You should have told me everything, Daddy. About the loan, about how deep this goes. You kept it all buried like Mama's old letters in that cedar chest, thinking it would stay dead." Her voice cracked on the last word. Henry winced. She had always known how to slice him open with the truth. Inside the barn, the air smelled of damp hay and wet horse. Lorraine paced beside Whiskey's stall, her boots leaving muddy prints on the concrete floor. "We can't just wait for him to come back with the sheriff and a piece of paper. He owns people in this town, Daddy, but he doesn't own everyone." She stopped pacing and looked him square in the eyes. "Let me call Jonah Whitfield. He knows people at the courthouse in Hensley County. And maybe Clint Ramsey over at the feed store. He hates Roscoe more than we do." Henry rubbed a hand down his face, feeling older than his 68 years. "Jonah can't fix this overnight, Lorraine. And Clint's a loudmouth. He'll tip Roscoe off before he helps us." He glanced at Whiskey, the bony colt who had somehow become the fragile line between survival and ruin. "But maybe we don't need to fight like this is my war alone anymore." For the first time, a spark of defiance flickered in Lorraine's tired eyes. She stepped closer to Henry, laying a hand over his calloused fingers where they rested on the stall door. "It's not just your war, Daddy. It's our home, too. You gave up too much for this ranch to let a snake like Roscoe swallow it whole. If we go down, we do it fighting. Together." She squeezed his hand until he looked up and saw that stubborn light that once made him believe anything was possible. Henry let out a shaky breath, then nodded slowly, the decision settling into his bones like a promise he intended to keep this time. Outside, the wind whipped through the broken fence line, rattling the loose boards Roscoe would soon claim for himself, unless Henry Barlow and his daughter found a way to draw a line in the dirt that even the devil wouldn't dare cross. By the next sunrise, the old Barlow ranch hummed with an energy it hadn't known in years. Henry stood by the splintered fence line, hammer in hand, pounding nails into a loose plank while Lorraine read through a stack of yellowed papers she'd found buried in Elsie's cedar chest. Between them, they were piecing together scraps of hope, determined to find one loophole Roscoe hadn't already poisoned. Lorraine shoved a page into Henry's rough hands. "Here, look. Mama signed part of the north pasture over to me when I turned 18. Roscoe can't touch what's in my name, not legally. We can leverage that at the bank, maybe stall him." Her voice shook with cold and exhaustion but not fear. Henry felt a flicker of pride he hadn't felt since teaching her to ride her first pony. He squinted at the paper, words swimming through tired eyes. "Your mother always did have more sense than I ever gave her credit for." He reached out, squeezing Lorraine's shoulder, a quiet apology for all the years he'd kept her at arm's length. "But paper won't keep Roscoe's boys off our fence. We need real hands. Folks we trust." Lorraine brushed her wind-tangled hair from her eyes and glanced down the muddy drive. "Jonah Whitfield said he'd come by with feed and medicine for Whiskey. He's bringing Clint Ramsey too. They've been talking to other ranchers who hate Roscoe's belly-deep pockets. Maybe it's enough to hold him off for a while." She gave a small, defiant smile. "You taught me never to corner an old dog unless you're ready for a fight. Well, we're the old dogs now, Daddy." Inside the barn, Whiskey lifted his head at the sound of boots crunching gravel. Jonah Whitfield's pickup rolled in, back end piled with feed sacks. Clint Ramsey hopped out before the engine even died, a burly man with fists the size of hammers and a grin that never reached his tired eyes. "Henry Barlow," Clint bellowed, clapping Henry's shoulder hard enough to jolt the hammer from his hand. "Heard you're finally done letting that snake Roscoe crawl all over you." "'Bout damn time." Henry managed a weak chuckle, rubbing his sore shoulder. "Better late than never, Clint. I appreciate you standing with us. Might get ugly before it gets better." Clint's grin widened into something fiercer. "Hell, Henry, ugly's what I do best." As thunder rolled again far off in the hills, Henry realized that for the first time in years he wasn't facing down the storm alone, and this time he was ready to fight tooth and nail for every acre left in his name. By dusk, the ranch yard was a tense fortress. Jonah Whitfield patched up Whiskey's hooves and ribs as best he could, while Clint Ramsey and 2 other ranch hands nailed up fresh boards on the weakest fence lines. Lorraine paced by the front porch, a rifle leaning against the railing, her eyes fixed on the winding dirt road that led up from the county highway. Each time dust rose in the distance, her heartbeat spiked. This time, she knew it wasn't just wind. Henry Barlow stood beside her, shotgun resting across his arm like an old friend. He could feel the ache in his shoulders, the same one that crept in every winter since his rodeo days. But tonight, pain didn't matter. Tonight, he was the man Elsie once believed could beat the devil at his own game. He caught Lorraine's eye and gave her the faintest nod. "We're ready," it said without words. The sun bled out behind the hills just as Roscoe Hensley's black truck rolled to a slow stop at the edge of the yard. This time, he didn't come alone. 2 other trucks flanked him, engines rumbling, shadows shifting in the cabins. Hired men, the kind Roscoe kept on retainer for dirty work too ugly for the law to touch. As the engines cut off, silence claimed the twilight, broken only by the restless whinny of Whiskey from the barn. Roscoe stepped out first, boots crunching gravel, that same damn smile carved on his face. He called out, voice dripping poison and mock courtesy. "Evening, Henry. Brought some friends. Figured I'd help you pack up. You and the filly there can head on to Houston. This land's due new ownership tonight." He gestured, and his men stepped forward, rifles slung lazy over their shoulders, but their eyes cold as the coming night. Before Henry could speak, Clint Ramsey stepped up beside him, a broad wall of muscle and fury, shotgun cocked and ready. "You ain't taking one fence post off this ranch tonight, Hensley. Not while I stand here." Behind him, Jonah and the other hands lined up like a ragged wall, farm tools and old deer rifles in hand. Lorraine climbed down from the porch, her own rifle steady, heart pounding so loud she swore Roscoe could hear it. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The wind rustled the dry grass. Whiskey whinnied again, as if sensing that tonight's fight wasn't just for him, but for every buried promise and broken piece of the Barlow name. Roscoe's smile slipped just enough to show the snake underneath. He raised a hand, a silent signal to his men. Henry shifted his grip on the shotgun. Tonight, one side would break, and he swore it wouldn't be his. The first shot wasn't planned. It cracked the tense silence like dry timber snapping under a boot. No one knew who fired first, but when the echo rolled off the hills, the front yard of the Barlow Ranch became a war zone. Clint Ramsey roared like a bull and charged forward, barrel aimed at the hired men closest to Roscoe's truck. Behind him, Jonah Whitfield pulled Lorraine behind the feed shed, yelling for her to keep her head down. Henry Barlow barely felt the recoil as his shotgun thundered. He moved on instinct alone, his old legs burning as he ducked behind the corral fence. Splinters flew when a bullet smashed into the rail just inches from his shoulder. Through the chaos, he caught sight of Whiskey rearing in his stall, eyes wild and nostrils flaring as gunfire and shouted curses turned the quiet ranch into a battlefield. Lorraine clutched her rifle so hard her knuckles whitened. Jonah's hand on her shoulder did nothing to calm the storm in her chest. "Stay low," he barked, but she didn't listen. She peered through a gap between feed sacks and saw Roscoe himself moving through the fray, calm, almost bored, as if he'd always known it would end like this. He raised a pistol and aimed for Clint's broad back. "No!" Lorraine screamed, breaking from Jonah's grip. She bolted across the muddy yard, sliding behind a rusted tractor just as Roscoe squeezed the trigger. Clint stumbled but didn't fall. The bullet grazed his side, tearing cloth and flesh but missing bone. He turned, eyes blazing, and fired back, the force knocking Roscoe off balance and sending him sprawling in the mud he'd once claimed to own. Amid the shouting and gun smoke, Henry crawled to where Roscoe lay clutching his bleeding arm. The two old men locked eyes under the cold, indifferent moon. Around them, hired men fled into the hills, leaving Roscoe alone with the ruin he'd brought on himself. Henry raised the shotgun, breath ragged. "You come to take everything, Roscoe? Take this too." But his finger never pulled the trigger. Instead, he tossed the shotgun aside, voice raw. "Get off my land. Crawl if you have to. Next time, I bury you myself." Roscoe's mouth twisted into a snarl, but his fight was gone. Lorraine ran to Henry's side, her arms wrapping around his broad shoulders just as Clint and Jonah limped over, battered but standing. In the distance, Whiskey nickered softly, alive, unharmed. The Barlows hadn't lost tonight. They had bled, they had broken fence posts and trust, but their roots held. And in the hush that fell over the battered ranch yard, one thing was clear. This land had chosen who would stay and who would not. By dawn, the last echo of gunfire had long faded, replaced by the quiet hum of crickets and the soft snort of horses in the barn. Henry Barlow sat on the porch steps, his coat draped around Lorraine's shoulders as she leaned her head against his arm. Clint Ramsey and Jonah Whitfield slept inside the barn, guarding what was left of the feed they'd fought so hard to protect. No one spoke of the law tonight. Sheriff Whitley would arrive when the sun rose, and Roscoe's threats would sound hollow without an army behind him. Lorraine watched the first light brush the broken fence lines and the bullet-scarred gate. "We'll need new boards," she murmured. Her voice was calm, tired but calm. Clint said he'd help rebuild. Jonah, too. Maybe even Vernon Pritchard, if he's man enough to admit Roscoe nearly ruined us all. Henry chuckled, the sound hoarse but real, a sound Lorraine hadn't heard from him in too long. Inside the barn, Whiskey rested in fresh straw, belly finally full, ribs a little less sharp against his skin. Jonah had promised he'd heal now that fear no longer chased him down every fence line. Henry rose, wincing at the ache in his knees, and limped to the stall. He pressed his forehead gently to the Colt's and closed his eyes, breathing in the warm, earthy smell that reminded him why he'd never given up. "You were never just a horse, were you, boy?" he whispered. "You were every promise I made your mama, and maybe the last chance I had to keep my word." Whiskey snorted softly, pushing his nose against Henry's chest. Lorraine leaned on the stall door, eyes shining in the pale light. "We keep him, right? No more auctions. No more debts hanging over us like vultures." Henry turned, tears brimming but refusing to fall. "No more auctions. No more selling pieces of us to men like Roscoe." He looked past her, out to the quiet dawn stretching over his battered ranch. For the first time in years, he didn't see a prison of bills and bad memories. He saw home, bruised but unbowed, the bones of something worth saving. Behind him, the barn door creaked open. Clint's deep laugh rumbled from the shadows. "Sun's up, Barlow. Time to fix fences and mend what can be mended." Lorraine squeezed Henry's hand. Together, they stepped out into the yard where the dirt was still churned from last night's stand. They would patch it, board by board, seed by seed. As the morning warmed the tired earth, Henry knew this fight had cost him more than he'd ever say out loud. But when Whiskey whinnied behind him, strong and hungry for life, he also knew one truth. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't to keep what you have, they're to prove you still deserve it.